So we're talking about compensation, and I think it's important to get into why compensation happens in the first place.
Exactly.
And obviously, there's some dysfunction somewhere that the body's trying to avoid that's either going into that pronation or that supination. Mm-hmm. And what we're looking at from the reset perspective is not just where the joint dysfunction is at, but the specific component of either the timing of the joint, is it pronating when it's supposed to pronate or supinating when it's supposed to supinate, but the specific plane of the component of pronation or supination.
Correct. It's a mouthful, but yes. Yeah. So you're really saying, is the dysfunction flexion or extension of a joint? Is it internal or external rotation? Is it abduction or adduction?
If it does that, yeah.
If it does that.
And we're not saying, can it not get there in terms of a range of motion perspective?
We're talking about...
We're looking at those unobservable dysfunctions of, can the body physically tolerate that position? Correct. So not just how much load, but just visiting that position, what kind of effect is it having through the motor control component, the processing?
Exactly. So that's a joint dysfunction that we're talking about.
Right. And it's not picked up through range of motion, because where the range of motion distortion is at can be somewhere through that kinetic chain, somewhere else.
Right. It can also be at the joint, just in a different plane.
Possibly.
Yeah.
But we don't.
How do we know?
Yeah.
Right.
We don't really care where we just know that there's range of motion dysfunction. Great. We just know that something's there. Mm-hmm. We identify where So that's the thing. I'm getting hung up on my words because I'm trying to add complexity to a simple topic.
Right.
And in the end, it's
pretty simple.
Where the body cannot tolerate specific planar joints is the source of a problem. That's what allows us to address focus our intervention to address that particular joint dysfunction. And then we have our checks and balance system of going through and seeing how that affect now.
Did it create positive change?
Right. Through that kinetic chain.
Right.
Pronation or supination, when it's supposed to be pronating or when it's supposed to supinate.
All right. So in a nutshell, we're going to wrap this up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have symptoms. We have negative outputs, whatever you want to term it. That could be instability, lack of mobility, range of motion issues. It could be poor performance of a pattern or movement. Yep. Things that you typically observe with your eyeballs. Right. So we know when we see those, we're saying those are just red flags that, hey, there's something wrong somewhere. There's deviant movement somewhere in the chain. We're trying to work our way backwards to find it. So once we see those things, those symptoms, we know that they're symptoms, and what we really need to find out is how the body's currently compensating.
Right.
And once we know how the body's currently compensating, it lets us know where to start searching for these joint dysfunctions.
Right.
So that's just a simple matter of load an appropriate joint in an appropriate plane and checking for negative consequences or negative outputs, and then we just deal with the deviant joint positions or the dysfunctional joint positions.
And it eventually leads us to once you clear the motor control, it does eventually lead us to we can get to the point where once the motor control is cleared, then it leads us to where the tissue dysfunction is at.
Sure.
And then we're getting through deeper layers of now that we increase if we use an intervention to increase that mobility, what's the motor control consequence of that?
Exactly.
And then always being accountable for how changes at one particular joint can affect upstream or downstream.
So always being accountable, so it's a really powerful aspect and component of what we're doing.
Right. Checks and balances, accountability, and unhindering ourselves or disconnecting ourselves from what we see as where the problem's at.
Correct.
Or that we're looking for the unobservable joint dysfunction.
It's easy to trust what we're seeing because it keeps happening over and over again. We're able to have an effect in a positive manner on all those outcomes on a very, very high percentage of people working with.
Right.
So it's easy to make that disconnect. We don't have to pay attention so much and be so focused on downstream stuff if we know we have a process that will allow us to find that source of compensation.
Yeah. So I think it's cool. I think we cleared we went through a lot of information on this whole concept of triplanar movement and pronation supination at a particular joint, the effect through the kinetic chain, the fundamental movement patterns that exist, and then the definition of compensation and the source of joint dysfunction.
The source of compensation, which is joint dysfunction.
Yep. So excellent. Thanks again for checking in, and until next time.
Take care.